Shaun, looks like you're there. Go ahead and take it away.
All right. Thank you, John. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
All right, good. Let's see if I can share a screen. And good to go there too, John?
You look great, Shaun. Take it away.
Okay. Thanks so much. Appreciate the opportunity to come and talk with you guys today, and great turnout. They asked me to talk a little bit about some of the work we've been doing, update on soybean management, and I'm going to concentrate tonight on some of the UAV, UAS work that we've done over the years. And SEPAC has been definitely one of our sites that has been in that role. It's been pretty much our standard seeding rate trials, and then we've kind of morphed them a little bit to include the UAV in this. And so want to make sure that I'm trying to do a couple things on the side here. There we go. Make sure that I have Richard Smith as the PhD student that's on this project and has been leading the effort, and then Alex and Joel down at Southeast Farm, as well as other PACs, have been a major part of that. And so we're going to kind of give an update of what we've been doing, how we've been processing this, and see if we get a little direction. All right, let's get that advancing. So, I mean, UAV's nothing new in terms of the last couple of years. I think most of us have had an appreciation for the casual scouting and what it can do for us. You know, a case in this point of, you know, just going up and getting the bird's eye view and catching tire compaction, very systematic tire compaction from, this happened to be a planter on soybeans. And so you see that pattern, and you can walk that and figure that out. And then even, you know, look at corn, soybean pour stands coming into play. Again, this casual scouting, spot infill. So that's certainly something that's neat, but we want to be able to move it to a point where can we use it as a management tool on some of these replants. And so that's a big part of this. And so here's a case. Let's see if I can get the laser pointer going. Laser pointer, you know, again, this is a field that you've flown, and you set up a pattern, so then you catch 200, 300 images, whatever it is, and overlaying those, and you get this orthomosaic. And so catching the drowned out spots on the regular digital picture off to the left, and then off to the right, you know, using the red and green and blue bands to create a vegetative indice. A lot of us are familiar with the NDVI. This happened to be the Vary, and so it's using a regular digital camera's color bands, red, green, and blue, to create this, whereas in NDVI's using more from the multi-spec and those bands. And so trying to do a lower cost version of this and moving forward. And so on soybeans, it's no surprise when you think about early detection on soybeans and whether we're to do a replant or not, need to be out there on the early side. I think most of us have an appreciation for timely planted beans. Down that neck of the woods, down in the southeast, those crawdad soils, I mean, it's hard to get out timely. And so even some of the timely plantings of general state level, maybe not the best, because those soils tend to be a little wetter, hold on to them longer. But even still, having late planted in well into June, late June, mid-Junes can wreak havoc on good yielding beans. And so that kind of comes into this case of how are we taking soybean stands, and how accurately are we doing that, and how fast are we going across the field. So in this case, I've got the two standard versions that we've had for years and decades, really, is go out, take the hula hoop, and, you know, count the number of plants in there and just upscale it. So in this case, you have a 32-inch diameter hula hoop, and you're counting 10 plants that equals 78,000 plants. And then again, are you representing that field? I mean, that's a small area. Similar vein, I've gone to the linear method just so I can have a tape measure on my hip and measuring out 21 inches of two 15-inch rows, and that's 1/10,000th of an acre. I double that and count twice as much to do one stand count. And so if I'm counting 24 plants in that area, divided by 2, and then I've got a stand of 120,000 plants. So this is how we've done it, just, again, boots on the ground, literally counting these plants. But the critical part of this is when we're doing it, and then to be able to cross the field in a fashion that you represent it. And so, you know, we're talking about VE to just when the cotyledons and the unifoliates The cotyledons are out and we go to VC when the cotyledons and unifoliates are fully expanded. And those are pretty young plants. Let's see. Then to the point of V2, a lot of us over the years have made the call of doing stand counts around V2, all the plants are up, hoping we got a good stand. But if we are subpar, let's say, and that's subpar for me in our research over the years is if we're around 70,000 plants, oh, there we go. Nothing like that moving around. Not sure if you can see me as the laptop fell down, but let me get it reset. There we go. I don't know whether you can see me or not. I'll just assume you got something, some version of me. And so with that, the idea is we're going to have V2, hoping you got a good stand. Well, at that point, if we're going to do replant, we've really lost out on the opportunity to do a proper timing. And so want to get out there early. And here's my point of doing that early to make sure that we're catching the proper growth stage and timing. This is a study that was done before my time, but it was a neat study looking at timing of this replant and then the scenario of how much yield is lost or not. And in this one, let me get the laser pointer back. So in this study, supplemental planting was at V2, and the plants were originally 2 trifoliates, and initial stand 200,000, 58 bushel beans, no problem. Let's go on down to it's got 132,000 stand, and they said that wasn't good enough. We want to go over the top, so we'll get 48 bushels from the original, and then another 5.5 bushels from that additional. But the overall yield level is really no different, 53, 55 bushel. Let's go on down to that gray area I talked about, 66, 67, 80, 70,000 plants. Yield level is 50, not nearly as good as our original stand of, again, 57, 58 bushel. But if we're going into overseed in this case, 130,000, 132,000, we'll get 41 bushel from the original stand. Those plants have already made the decision to branch by this point V2 and to compensate for that open area. But in this case, we've overseeded it and gained 10.5 bushel, but we've lost basically 10 bushel by that mechanical damage. And so we're no better off at the V2 with this 70, 66,000 stand. And certainly if we want to just jump off the cliff, till it all up and do high seeding rate because the later planting, yield level wasn't there. All that's to be said that V2 really is too late, and here's the whys. And again, that 70,000-ish gray is a gray area. We had another study when I first started that we looked at the timing of delay and really trying to catch the best time. And so I just kind of made the point that V2 is probably not the best. And so we had an original stand where we had 50,000. So I'll use this schematic here where the black, solid black is 50,000 every 15 inches. And then we interseeded with another 50,000 in the gold lines in between. So the overall stand's 100,000. But we decide whether we did it at no delay, same day of planting, or we are looking at the VC. So when the original plants were at VC, so codlings and unifoliates fully expanded, to when the original plants were V2, original plants were V4. And so at this point, pictures taken into June, the original plants were V7. You can see kind of the shading that comes into play. Let's go. Then by the end of the season, near the end of the season, what does this really look like? And so original stand, no delay, and the relay or the interplanting. And so they have that same kind of branching, decent pod load, 50-50 on what they're providing to the overall yield. VC, at this point, again, setting the point of when we need to be out there making this call, VC. So when the plants are cotyledons and unifoliates fully expand, so we're talking, a couple inches here. The original stand was 50,000, branched up. It's already made that decision. I make that very clear that it's already decided to start branching by that point because the light quality around it. Then we interseeded, and then you have plant that's contributing a little bit, but they're not branching. And when it comes to the end of the day in the yield, that delayed planted one is maybe on the order of 10 to 15% of the overall yield, whereas the remaining 80% is from that original stand. And then if we go to when it's V2, the original plant was V2, we have maybe 5%, 7% coming from that replant. So again, just trying to make the point of this decision has to be made early if we're going to do any replanting to gain that advantage. And then as we jump off the cliff at V4, certainly we don't get anything at the tail end of the season. We just get the twig. And then here's a case of if the original stand was 100,000 plus another 100,000, certainly we shouldn't have any issue with, 200,000 plants. But what you will see is that the contribution is much less. So we have greater shading with 100,000 original plus 100,000, and certainly by the V2 scenario, we've got original plants that are doing 100%, and then the replant is contributing nothing. It's a twig at that point. The good thing out of those is that they never become a weed in that regard. So now moving all that forward to our UAV work and really trying to do all that work up front. So VE, VC, V1, that's the point. And we flew these fields all season long, and Richard did, I should say. So let's get into those. All right. So we want to address the spatial variability, and I want to get out there and do it in a timely fashion. So what's the ability of these UAS and this UAV system to assess the stands and plant populations and growth stage? And then to figure out a process, how do we get there? Is it just images? Do we use vegetative indices? And on the onset of this, my approach was not to count plants, but to look at canopy. I think the idea of trying to count soybean plants to their structure, I just don't think that's worth it. I think that we gain more with the ability to harvest sunlight. And so that's been my take, is to look at a canopy coverage more so than an actual plant stand. So my goal in a way is to say, what's the critical canopy cover at VC, V1, V2, rather than optimal plant stand. So they're the traditional field scale trials where we go from 50 to 250,000 seeding rate. Right, and in this case, we did 2 different cultivars across the PAC system. And I'm just going to highlight a few of these trials that we've done over the last couple of years. 2 cultivars that have different structure, again, trying to think through if there's different architecture in the way that plant grows, leaf shape, those kind of things. And then 3 to 5 replications per PAC. And so here's a case, this one of the Southeast farms fields, and so this just happens to be one of our older ones where we did 5 seeding rates and then repped across that field. Okay, so field scale trials we did all the way from up in the northeast farm, go down to Davis, southeast, and then we caught the western side as well as Penny, the agronomy farm, and Meigs right south of Lafayette. Today we'll talk a little bit about some of the results from 2019 and 2020, looking at the 2019 season, just making the comment that it was a late planted year, and so that comes into play. We had 2 conventional tillage systems, whereas you would imagine that the ground cover, so residue, would have an issue on the way that this processing occurs versus no-till. And again, the pairing of varieties for the locations. In 2020, what we've been able to get across in time for today's talk is just a few of the locations from Penny, Davis, and the Southeast farm. Okay, did a lot of different measurements, and so in the course of 12 more minutes here, I'll kind of get through again the idea of canopy coverage, vegetative indices, and then some of the terrain attributes in the way that we look at where water accumulates and putting weather into this. We use the DJI Matrice platform. So this is higher end, but it allows us to swap in and out different cameras, and that's what we're doing there. Let me try to let someone in the room. Automatic, here we go. All right, and then with this can simply be turned over into the Phantom 4s and so forth, so that the concept's still the same. So we've got these transitions, and then trying to select the best path. And so in this, catching equal variability. So we did transects across this. So we've got the trial planted left to right, and then we did transects of low altitude flights going across, as well as plant stands. And so within that, stepping across this field and laying clay clay pigeons down to mark those and to be able to go directly back to that point, have ground control points, and to reference that exact area. So the crew would go out, let me get the laser back, go out and then put a 10 foot by 10 foot PVC structure, count the plants, and then we have the ground control of this as well as moving across with the imagery. Low altitude flights were a part of this as well as the high altitude. High altitude is where we want to be because that's where you're going to cover a lot of ground literally in a fast fashion. The low altitudes is to be another level of ground truth. So with that, low altitude in this case was 30 foot above the field, and again, very, very nice precision. And then high altitude that we settled in on was 250 foot altitude with 75% overlap in the front and then the side. To do this kind of work, you need the ground control points as we've laid out here. So then every image, especially when you do a orthomosaic, can be pieced together and then brought back to where they need to be every single time, because you're doing multiple flights across this field and you want to make sure that you can get across it. So we'll go through a few of those time series. This happens to be up in the Northeast farm. And this was the 250 foot altitude. Again, 75% front overlap, side overlap, stitch all these images together with the trowel underneath of it. And so, believe it or not, this field has V1 soybeans. So this is when you have one trifoliate fully expanded. And you're thinking, how in the world? There's no way. And this is the same thing that we're trying to figure out on the ground, walking that field. Where do you look? Is there even plants there? This is a no-till field. You go to V3, you can start to see some of this stripe out a little bit at the higher rates, higher seeding rates, okay? And then certainly as we get to R1 and move on down the rest of the season as we get canopied, you know, we want to be green to the eye by the 4th of July, so go back to that R1. And so we certainly have varieties that are that way. But thinking through that, we want to be able to, at V1, if not even earlier, to make a decision of a replant. And so by my naked eye, I'm like, there's no way. But that's the beauty of running some of this through the computer and doing some of the binary threshold that I'm about to share that Richard and others have gotten into. All right, and so let's kind of zoom in on this where we've got the overall 250 foot altitude flight, and then Richard's pulled this out, and so we've split it. So off to the left here, you've got what the image would look like when it's stitched together at 250 foot altitude, and then you've got these transects. We did 2 per field, right? These low altitude transects, so it's the 30 foot altitude, very low, and you could even see rowing these individual plants. Okay, that's at V1. Again, if you did a drive-by, you could probably even row those, but at the higher altitude, not as much. And then each one of these plots, again, are ground controlled. They've got you can even see it in this image, I'll put the dot over it, the clay pigeon to go back to it every single time and look at different populations. So in doing this, I come up with a method to quantify how many green pixels, so basically the area of plants versus the ground area, and then using that to assess, do we have an adequate stand or not. So in the initial stages of this, we're doing the rate response. So seed rate response, get the canopy or rate response and get the yield at the end of the season, and then to calculate what was the optimal plant population, all right? And then go back in time, looking at the images at the growth stages of those plots and get what the canopy was. And so then over the course of these years, come up with what's a percent canopy cover that we need by VC based on how that plant performed with yield at the end of the season. So we have to do some of this post-mortem to figure it out, but that's the process. And getting to that, and we have the regular digital picture, and then we come into these bands and create a vegetative indices. So this one, I think he's done a number of different ones, so from the berry to the green leaf index, GLI, and others like that. And then to get into binary, yes or no. So with this, the yeses being it has the green pixels that have been converted to white pixels, and then everything else is converted to black. So it's easy to count yes, nos, and do what the proportion of canopy cover is. So plant pixels versus all, get the percentage, okay? And so this is just a time series with one image to get the point across. This one's V1. All right, and that's what the original picture looked like. You come in and they do the vegetative indice, all right, and then do the binary threshold. And so the canopy on this picture was 8%. Go to V3, obviously more plant area, more growth, more leaf area, and then go through that same stepwise process of creating a vegetative indice to make it easier to do the yes, no's, and then come into a canopy coverage of 21%. V5, R1, and then by R1, again, we want to be green to the eye by 4th of July. Usually that's by the time we're flowering. Out the top, R1 to R2, 97%. So that concept should kind of make sense that you can see how much that canopy is being covered. We're just using the computer to populate what that is instead of estimating it ourselves. So in the last 5 minutes or so, I'll go through some of the various indices we've looked at. The low altitude, again, that 30-foot altitude versus the high altitude, where that's the whole field. We have the growth stage at VC, V1, V3, and to the end of the season. And what I want to concentrate on is these are R-squares, so the correlations of how well are these indices predicting the plant population. That's what we've looked at with this. So the dotted line is one that I always want you to look at. That's our canopy coverage. All right. The GLI is the indice that seems to be pulling out fairly well for us. And so that's using just red, green, blue bands, so a regular digital camera. And then one that's a little more mainstream in terms of a digital camera setup is Vary. So that's going to be of the orange. And just to have that as a concept of, it's probably not performing as well for this express purpose, whereas a canopy coverage and the GLI seem to be doing much better. So with this, laying that out, this is up at Penny in 2020. Canopy coverage as early as VC. This is low altitude, 30-foot altitude, 0.8, 0.9, very good, and they maintain the ability to look at canopy coverage and predicting what the plant population would be. Okay, V1, V3. GLI, that's the indice that we're starting to see a little more promise. Maybe not as high, 0.6 or so, and the Vary nowhere near it. Now let's go down to the high altitude, which is where we want to be, because high altitude, we can do a field in 20 minutes, whereas at low altitude, there's no way we can do this in a feasible manner. And so with that, on the first set here at the 2020 Penny location, GLI, VC, that's kind of on the early side. By the time we're coming into V1, upwards of 0.8. So that's starting to show some fairly good promise of predicting what the plant population is with. We got both dotted line, the canopy coverage, as well as the GLI. If you go back to the image, I did a time series of that whole field. V1, you would not even be able to look at that, right? Our naked eye, we couldn't pull that apart, whereas we're able to do this with the software and to work through that. So that's at Penny. Southeast Farm. So in 2020, the stands were very, very low. And so that's where I think this breaks off a little bit at this high altitude, because we had stands that were sub 10,000 plants per acre. So I think it went from 5 to 125,000. So I think that's just fallen off the cliff, so to speak. Whereas if we're closer to having like a 50,000 and upwards, and that's probably where I'll have Richard to look at this data set again, I think we're going to see more promise for the high altitude and the GLI, as well as maybe the canopy coverage. And Davis Farm in 2020 looked very good in terms of predicting. I'll go back to the 30-foot altitude and predicting the plant population with canopy coverage. When we look at the GLI by V1, it's looking really good as well. Come down to where, you know, they think about a crop consultant, think about a farmer going across the field, an extension educator, do the whole field. By the time we're coming to V1, we have some pretty good correlations with what the plant population is with the GLI as well as the canopy coverage. So that's some very promising results in that way. So then we can use this as a tool to make that replant decision and not be too late. What I mean by being too late, again, is that V2 or later, I just don't think that we're making the decision or replanting at the proper time. We need to be between this VC to V1 is the point that we need to be making that call across that whole field. So with that, I know we didn't have much time to get into a lot of the details, but I think that there is some possibilities as we move forward with this. I think that the idea of using a canopy coverage is one that shows a lot of promise. It's very accurate and correlates very well at the early stages. So even at VC, I think we see some really good correlations. The GLI is another one, especially whenever we put it in a higher altitude with what would be a standard flight pattern. What I want to leave you with is using some of the 2019 data. Haven't gotten into 2020 yet, but based on our 2019 data across most of the packs, by VC, if we had VC to V1, if we had a canopy coverage of 4%, which again sounds crazy, but 4% canopy coverage that or higher, we optimize yield and we didn't need to do anything else. So again, you go back to the picture where you couldn't see it and I couldn't see it. If we calculated 4% canopy, we were well within the realms of optimal. And then by the time we went to V1, V2, we were closer to 15%, 15 to 20% canopy coverage. We didn't need to make a decision. So again, I think that we're starting to peel this apart to have some of those opportunities for making a decision in that way. So with that, I'd like to thank the support of Richard and his project, the Wabash Heartland Innovation Network. I also want to thank all the PACs for all their work in terms of planting the trials, helping us, maybe even having a few flights for us. We appreciate that. And Richard's the one to really thank. He's a PhD student that's been one grinding on this, doing the flights, catching the days without the popcorn clouds, and then processing, and then just going back and forth. So with that, I would be happy to entertain any questions in the minute or so I've got left.
Shaun, thank you so much. Great presentation here. We have one question. What is GLI?
Green leaf index. And I'd have to go back to look at it's using the red, green, and blue bands from a regular digital camera, but it's just the equation. And I may even, let's see, I may even have it in here. If I go back quick enough, because I haven't got that one memorized myself. Well, I thought, do the whole presentation, you want to get to see it. Well, it must have been one I took out. So green leaf index, and again, it's using the red, green, blue, just in a different proportion.
Perfect. Shaun, thank you again. We are going to move on to our next presentation.